He kōna e purangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
On Thursday the 10th of January 1985, Ernie leaves Mount Eden prison. He's sitting in the back of a police car, a four-door Holden Kingswood, for the 10-minute trip to the Auckland Central Police Station. At this point, Ernie's just an inmate who was working in the kitchen when Darcy was killed, serving a 3-year, 3 months prison term, though this would later be dropped to 2 years on appeal. Ernie's someone the police suspect knows more than he's saying. They have a hunch he's their mystery note writer. Ernie's driven into the basement car park of the 11-storey building that Auckland City cops call home. The car door opens, and soon he's into a lift that whisks him up a couple of floors. He steps out, and as he's marched down the carpeted corridor, he passes through the beating heart of the CIB. The decor is grey, functional and practical, but not overly warm or welcoming. Phones are ringing, officers are looking at who got arrested last night, while typewriters are hard at work documenting the day's crime-fighting efforts. But there's only one crime Ernie's here to talk about. He finally arrives at his destination, the office of Detective Chief Inspector Peter Jenkinson, the man leading the inquiry into the murder of Darcy Tahira. Ernie finds Jenkinson seated at a big wooden desk. Also present is his 2IC, Detective Sergeant Neil Morris. What happens next is unclear. It's shrouded in controversy, because neither Morris nor Jenkinson wrote anything down. Police later said, and I quote, "No notes were kept of this discussion, as at Ernie's insistence it was off the record." And that's a major problem, given the case against Ross Appelgren hinged on the outcome of Ernie's conversation with Jenkinson that day.
My first question to him was, and I remember sitting in the office, and I think he was 4 or 5 stories up. I looked at the window to see if it was open. I felt that I was going to get chucked out the window.
You're listening to Nark, an RNZ investigative podcast. I'm your host, Mike Wesley Smith. This is episode 6, Blurred Lines. I've already outlined what the Crown told Ross's 2 trials about how Ernie became their star witness. I called that version 1. It was pretty straightforward. Ernie was removed from Mount Eden shortly after the murder. He had an initial chat with police, thought about things, and then gave his formal witness statement 6 weeks later. And bang, police were off to the races to arrest Ross. Well, in this episode, I'm going to take you through version 2, which includes the many parts the juries didn't hear.
Deeply troubling. Deeply troubling.
It's instead a descent into the murky world of the Police Witness Protection Program, where nothing is black and white.
The government had dispatched an emissary to Ernie with the offer of a pardon.
And things, extraordinary things, are kept hidden, sometimes for decades.
That then puts it into the grey area, big time.
Up front, you need to know that much of what I'll outline in this episode was either not presented or properly explored, at least in my view, at either of Ross Appelgren's 2 trials. I've instead had to piece it together from police documents and Ernie's letters and notes, which Ross only obtained years after he was convicted. Following his death, all these documents simply gathered dust in Julie's spare room until she handed them to me. That means some of this material and its significance are being revealed for the first time in this podcast. To start, I want to take you back to the 8th of January 1985. It's the end of the second full day of the Darcy Tahira murder investigation. Lead Detective Peter Jenkinson has gathered his team together to discuss how the investigation is progressing. All present knew what Jenkinson would later describe in a report, that it had been a frustrating start to their attempt to find out who killed Darcy Tahira.
The inquiries at the prison were difficult and protracted due to the type of witness the police were dealing with. The common theme was that the prisoners would not talk to the police or be seen to be talking to the police for fear of retaliation.
Leading the briefing alongside Jenkinson is his 2IC, Detective Sergeant Neil Morris. I've tried unsuccessfully to contact Morris to see if he'd speak to me for this podcast. I did, though, come across a profile and a picture of him in the New Zealand Herald published in 1991. It said 35-year-old Morris joined the police in 1968. With a thick moustache and neat side part, he looked the quintessential 1980s crime fighter. A man whose 19-year policing career coincided with a turbulent period for Kiwi cops and the country. Morris had helped fend off the protests that erupted during the controversial 1981 Springbok rugby tour.
Police with short truncheons are trying to hold back a line of protesters.
And he was one of the team of detectives who arrested the French spies that bombed the Greenpeace ship, the Rainbow Warrior, in Auckland in 1985. Morris even had an actor play him in the 1993 movie about the bombing.
I'm sorry. Are my questions upsetting you?
With no witnesses and no answers, Jenkinson and Morris opened the briefing by describing a key and what I think is a controversial step in their investigation. They'd conducted a reconstruction of how Darcy's murder might have played out and who could have been the killer.
We're discussing the duty prison officer's statement.
Morris is referring to Jim Stedman, the guard on duty at the time, who had walked police through his movements the morning Darcy was killed. I've had actors read from meeting notes and reports written by Jenkinson and Morris.
Talking mainly with the prison officer, we were able to establish who was in the kitchen right at the exact time, where they were standing and who best would have seen it. From those deductions, it was who was washing the dishes at the time Darcy was whacked.
Of course, who was washing dishes was Ernie. Morris put the exact time of Darcy's assault at 7:15 a.m.
Particular emphasis is given to about 17 minutes around the crucial time. It becomes quite interesting the way it evolves.
Morris believes it evolves like this. Ernie tells Stedman something's up with Darcy.
Just prior to Ernie's approach to him, Stedman can't recall seeing Appelgren.
Stedman heads to the lunchroom. Ernie returns to washing dishes.
In their 20 to 30 seconds, Stedman ascertains things are strange. Comes out of kitchen, saw Ernie at dishes, Appelgren not there.
Stedman then explains to Morris that he leaves the lunchroom to call the nurse and returns through the kitchen to see
Ernie still doing dishes, can't recall seeing Appelgren.
Stedman then leaves the nurse for around 20 seconds.
Sees Appelgren back at his boiler, Ernie still doing dishes immediately before the incident.
What Morris says next in the briefing makes clear the police suspect list has drastically shortened.
Bearing in mind his view of the whole kitchen from his office sitting down, except for a couple of areas behind pillars near the dishwashers, only two persons closest to the room, Appelgren and Ernie.
Another detective then asks,
where could Appelgren have gone?
Now at this point, head detective Peter Jenkinson pipes up.
He's the only one gone missing during the time. Definitely looking at taking Ernie out of Mount Eden prison in the morning. Leave Appelgren to sweat a little longer.
In my view, it's clear from that comment that Jenkinson had identified Ross as the prime suspect and Ernie as someone they needed to protect. Let's start with Ross as a suspect. By the time the detective's briefing took place, 4 p.m. on the afternoon of 8th January, there was no evidence linking Ross to the murder. In fact, the only cop who'd spoken to Ross by this point had concluded he was
not a likely suspect for the assault, judged by his general background and demeanour during interview.
And remember, all 18 inmates in the kitchen block had been interviewed, and none had provided any assistance to police. There was also no forensic evidence and no record of any information or any witness identifying Ross as the killer. Even Ernie's anonymous notes, remember the ones he scribbled using his left hand, well, those notes didn't name Ross, and Ernie had twice told the cops he knew nothing about the murder. So what was it that put Ross in the police crosshairs? Yeah, that reconstruction, and the comments detectives made in the briefing about it. We've just heard them, but they bear repeating.
Only two persons closest to the room, Appelgren and Ernie.
Where could Appelgren have gone?
He's the only one gone missing during the time.
So Ross is standing nearby and then disappears. Okay, I can see how that looks suspicious. But this is where things get shaky. Remember, there were 7 inmates in the kitchen around the time Darcy was killed. How are they ruled out and why? Well, we simply don't know. I haven't seen any police records describing the reconstruction itself, just police discussions about its outcome. Now, it might be this was contained in the investigation file police now say is lost. What I do have is a copy of the only police statement Steadman had given by the time of the detective's briefing on the 8th of January 1985. In it, Steadman doesn't say Ross and Ernie were the only inmates closest to the lunchroom just before the incident. In fact, Steadman doesn't even mention Ross by name in his statement. So if not Steadman, where were the police getting their information from?
It invites speculation about whether the suspicion is evidence-based.
That's Tim McKinnell. You'll remember he's the investigator working for Ross's estate to overturn his conviction.
One of the things that occurs in these wrongful conviction cases so often is that they are led and they go awry early on because of myopia. And a particular police officer or a particular unit's view of what happened, regardless of evidence to the contrary or gaps in the evidence.
Okay, the next thing is the importance the police gave to Ernie in this briefing, which is also questionable because, according to what the Crown later said at trial, Ernie hadn't told police anything by this point. He hadn't even been identified as the writer of the anonymous notes. He was just the guy washing dishes, with a view of the lunchroom. Years later, the police interest still puzzled Ernie.
I guess the question that I've never really thought about much in later years, but I did think earlier in the piece, how did they know to talk to me?
Okay, fast forward 2 days on from that briefing to Ernie's trip to Auckland Central Police Station. The one we opened this episode with. The one that took place on the 10th of January 1985. The one that there's also no official record of.
You cannot have off-the-books conversations with a crucial witness.
That's Tim McKinnell again. He's right. The police manual, even back in 1985, said all information officers received during an investigation was supposed to be recorded in their notebooks. They were required to obey that rule.
One of the things that we've learned about some of these wrongful conviction cases over the years is that there is a tendency to have off-the-record conversations, have meetings that aren't documented or recorded, and occasionally that information slips out through another document or through another person or through another witness. Sometimes it's years later before it's uncovered.
The reason I know about this meeting is because I learned snippets of what was discussed between Ernie, Morris and Jenkinson in documents not presented at either of Ross's trials and Ernie's later recollections that he made to me.
First time I saw Jenkinson was at the office at his police station. You know, nice office, looked like some sort of business office.
Ernie said he was anxious at that point, not knowing what police were going to do.
I do remember a conversation. I talked about a phone book. I said, well, is what someone going to have it bashed out of me with the phone book or dropped out of the side of the police station? I remember saying that because that was what they used to talk about in the system, you know, about how people used to get abused and, yeah, you know, police would bash people with the phone book to get answers. And that's what I said to Jenkinson, and he looked at me clearly and I said, how many floors up are we?
To this, Ernie said Jenkinson remained silent.
And I mean, that didn't break the ice. He was quite serious. I got up and went to look at the window, but I couldn't see it because it was all, it sort of had curtains and like frosted glass at the bottom, and I thought, oh well, they don't look like they're open. So then I sat down again, and that was how the first 2 or 3 minutes went.
It's hard not to imagine how incredibly vulnerable Ernie was at this very moment. Here's a guy we've heard try to jump off Auckland Harbour Bridge rather than return to prison. A guy who's been scared the whole time he was in Mount Eden. And now he's standing before one of Auckland's most senior detectives, wondering if he's about to get a hiding. So when Jenkinson did speak, his directness, his pointedness, it must have sent his already tingling nerves through the roof when Jenkinson told Ernie,
we think you know what we want. And it could only have been 2 people who did it, as only 2 people were there at the time, Ross and you. And we don't believe it was you, so you must have seen who it was. Or was it you?
You heard that right. In their very first encounter, according to Ernie at least, the head detective is suggesting he might actually be a suspect in Darcy's murder.
There is effectively pressure being put on Ernie in terms of his position and what it is he might need to say to save his own skin.
Investigator Tim McKinnell.
Hugely problematic, highly risky, and I would argue unethical to put that to somebody. You're inviting him to point the finger at a particular person and at the same time suggesting that if you don't, it might be you.
In a report Jenkinson later wrote, supports Ernie's account that police initially considered him a possible suspect.
From reconstruction, it was obvious that Ernie, a fraud offender, was either a witness or the offender in this homicide. The other possibility was Ross Appelgren.
They've already created their own theory, and now they're searching for somebody to help them prove that theory.
Ernie later expanded on what Jenkinson told him was behind the police request to meet with him.
He said to me that he had interviewed a prison officer the day before, Mr. Steadman, Jimmy Steadman, who was the kitchen officer the day of the offence. And he said that Mr. Steadman had narrowed it down to 2 people that had been in the kitchen at that time that could have done what was done. He indicated to me that I might know who it was.
Now I think either Ernie or police have misunderstood or misrepresented Steadman's statements. He gave 2, the one before the detective's briefing on the 7th of January and another on the 9th, the day before Ernie was hauled in to see Jenkinson. In neither account did Steadman narrow down the potential killer list to Ernie or Ross. He didn't even name a suspect. Now I must say, apart from Jenkinson's suggestion Ernie was the witness or the suspect, I have not seen any evidence pointing to Ernie as Darcy's killer. So let's step back and see how Ernie's undocumented and somewhat dubious transformation from just another inmate to crucial eyewitness actually happened. On the 6th and 7th of January, Ernie tells detectives he knows nothing about the murder. During the same period, he writes his anonymous notes, and again, he doesn't name Ross, and says he never saw the murder done. Then, police conduct a reconstruction of how they believe the killing unfolded, narrowing the suspect list down to Ross or Ernie. On the 10th of January, police put their you or Ross theory to Ernie, claiming this information had all come from Steadman. Then only after that conversation, Ernie names Ross for the first time as the killer. Again, I need to stress, Ernie's account that he was considered a suspect was never given to the 2 juries who convicted Ross.
It's concerning that wasn't before either of the juries. It's more than concerning, it's deeply troubling.
And the significance of all this is made all the more obvious when you consider what the Court of Appeal later ruled. The judges said Ernie could be seen as credible because no other reason had been suggested for him naming Ross as the offender. Of course, the Court of Appeal also had no idea Ernie had started out as a possible suspect in the eyes of the police. What happens next in the meeting between police and Ernie on January 10th is also disputed. Peter Jenkinson's version is what he wrote in an August 1986 report to Police National Headquarters.
Ernie was interviewed by myself and Detective Sergeant Morris. He admitted being the writer of the anonymous notes and verbally told us of what had transpired in the kitchen when Tahita had been murdered.
That contradicts what the Crown and Ernie told both of Ross's trials. Prosecutors maintained Ernie didn't tell police anything about the murder until 6 weeks later. That's the 22nd of February 1985. But if Jenkinson's August 1986 report is true, and you have to ask, would he really lie to police top brass? Ernie told police what happened in the kitchen at this first meeting on the 10th of January 1985. There's also other evidence to support that this is what in fact took place. Firstly, Ross was moved out of Mount Eden on January 11th, the very next day after Ernie met with Jenkinson. According to a prison official, this was because of Ross's alleged involvement in the Darcy Tahira homicide. Then there was a police report dated 18th of January 1985, so about a month before Ernie was supposed to have told police anything. which said, quote, Ernie, although not an eyewitness to Darcy Tahira's murder, can say that the suspect was alone with the deceased at the time and that he heard the sounds of the assault. That information can only really come from what Ernie told Jenkinson. You may have also noticed there that the report said Ernie was, quote, not an eyewitness, which got my attention, as I'm guessing it probably has yours, because within weeks, that's exactly what Ernie became. So why isn't there any record of a by-the-book statement from Ernie on January the 10th? Jenkinson's now dead, but his 1986 report offers this explanation.
Ernie was reluctant, for obvious reasons, to commit himself to a statement, as he expected the police to abandon him to the terrors of retaliation within the prison system. Tim McKinnell doesn't buy it.
Well, the recording of it doesn't place his safety at any greater risk than not recording of it. The disclosure of it is the difficult part. If you're going to tell the truth about it, then the risk remains the same as if you documented it.
For another, more independent perspective, I spoke to a senior retired Auckland detective who asked not to be named. He worked with Jenkinson in the 80s and considered him a good cop. He told me, quote, it's unusual that there would not be a written record of all interactions the police had with an essential witness like Ernie. Even if Ernie had insisted on a discussion being off the record, police investigating a homicide would normally record everything, although that record might be held separately from the main investigation file. But as you heard in an early episode, police say they have lost their files for the Darcy Tahira investigation. Fortunately, there is no argument about what happened next between Ernie and Jenkinson. At Ernie's request, Jenkinson had a lawyer come and speak with him at the police station on January the 10th.
I spoke to him about the involvement of it all, and he said, I need protection. Whether or not I give the information, owing to the amount of information I have on so many. So, we negotiated on it.
Yeah, they negotiated on it.
I went to visit him, and he was in a state.
That's Paddy O'Driscoll, the lawyer who came to see Ernie. He'd represented Ernie on some of his past fraud charges.
He was in a state that he had seen something occur that would end up with him getting in trouble if he said nothing. But at the same time, he felt obligated to say something because he didn't want the person that did it to get away.
Paddy's now retired, but he worked as a defence lawyer for decades in Auckland. Along the way, he's acted for a few people like Ernie, asked to testify for the police when their safety was at risk. He's never spoken publicly before about his involvement in this case.
He struck me as genuine in his concerns. He wasn't bullshitting me. You know, he was telling me the situation as he saw it.
And what can you recall was it that he told you?
That he'd been in the kitchen and that he'd seen someone get hit over the head with a soup spoon and the person had died. And he said, look, that's not me. I'm a fraudster. I don't do violence like that. And he was upset about it.
So you believed he was telling the truth?
But that's why I would rather have been his lawyer than I would have been Ross Appelgren's.
Did you recall either Mr. Jenkinson or Ernie ever communicating to you that he, at least initially, had been considered a suspect by the police?
No. I don't think in the way he was talking to me that he was answering about that he might go down on a murder charge. He knew he wasn't going down on a murder charge.
Now, I know Paddy was Ernie's lawyer, but nonetheless, I found his impressions of Ernie and his reliability to be significant. It's a genuine counterweight to Ross and his legal team's decades-long effort to paint Ernie as a complete shyster.
Did he name Ross Appelgren as the killer to you?
No, I don't think he did. That name came up later. He just said that there was a guy. I don't recall Ross's name being mentioned. He was still deciding whether he was going to come off the fence or not in terms of naming Ross Appelgren to people. I don't think he'd made that decision by the time he got to me. He was still quite jumpy.
According to Jenkinson's later report, Ernie and Paddy presented conditions police had to meet before Ernie would provide a written statement.
So he was struggling with two things. One was wanting to do the right thing as he saw it and protecting himself, which was his priority.
Would you have formulated those conditions on your own, or would you have consulted about them with Ernie?
I formulated them on my own, and then I ran them past him so that he could say yay or nay, and that's what I did.
As Jenkinson later described, it included, in effect, a request for Ernie to enter the witness protection program.
Ernie to be kept in a place of safety right through to the end of his sentence, and confidentiality be assured. If, at the end of 3 weeks, if Ernie had not been threatened or assaulted, he would then make his statement. Ernie to be relocated at the end of his sentence in Australia under a new identity.
Not only a new life, but a bunch of cash to go with it.
I have discussed this with Ernie, and he would be happy with a new identity and sufficient funds for him to relocate himself.
The offer of money, any money, must have been attractive to Ernie, who police knew had zero income and savings and debts of more than $70,000. Ernie, though, would later recall that Jenkinson said this would all be doable, but there was a catch. The case against Ross first had to be successful. Now the pressure was really on. Let's pause for a minute here. In the 5 days after Darcy's bashing, we have police identifying Ernie as a witness through an undocumented reconstruction. We have police saying he's either a witness or a suspect. Then we have Ernie saying he'll talk as long as certain demands are met.
I think that's a very, very high risk in my personal and I guess professional opinion.
That's former Detective Inspector Lance Burdett. He didn't work on Darcy's case, but I wanted to talk to him because he's led homicide investigations, managed important witnesses, and for 2.5 years headed national operations for the New Zealand Police Witness Protection Program.
It's really important to understand that the Witness Protection Program has been working very successfully as a program. In other words, there's not one witness that's ever been compromised.
So what is the Witness Protection Program? Well, it safeguards people who face serious threats as a result of assisting police, particularly in criminal investigations and prosecutions.
Witness protection officers have one role, and that is to protect the person they've been asked to protect.
If required for safety reasons, some witnesses will be relocated with living expenses paid for by police. They might also receive a new identity and, in certain cases, can receive a financial payment. And it's important to say that for decades, the courts have endorsed these types of arrangements in the interests of the witnesses' safety and to ensure that they can give crucial evidence without fear of retaliation. For their part, though, defence lawyers often portray these deals as nothing more than bribes.
And that's what the Defence Counsel do. Right? All I'm trying to say is, well, look, they've been given an inducement. Well, have they? You know, your life is just never the same again. Could you imagine being alive and never allowed to even contact any of your loved ones ever again? Because you're not allowed to. If you get caught doing that, you're off. Probably the majority of witnesses want to know, are they going to truly be safe? So you're stuck in this whole world of, well, we've got a lot we can give you, but I don't want to tell you that to induce you to give the evidence. Right? And so the witness is thinking, well, I'm not giving the evidence until you've told me what you can do for me. And it's a fine line to walk between offering an inducement and offering protection.
However, Lance is very clear about one thing. Police should always record a witness's statement before the witness gets told what they might receive in return. And that's consistent with police policy in the 1980s. No promises were to be made to witnesses, particularly those in custody, to induce them to give favourable evidence.
It's always, you tell us the information, we will action that information, and then we will talk about it later. We will give you compensation for the fact that you have to restart your life and relocate and all of that sort of, right? I can't imagine any reason why it be talked about before the information is received. You know, it's just fraught with danger and risk.
Of course, that appears to be just what happened in the police negotiations with Ernie.
In order for those senior officers to discharge their responsibility to have assessed the quality of the evidence, presumably they would want to have that the first utterances of the account, the first account to be recorded
so they could actually see what the witness's evidence was before there was any discussion about any type of benefit. Or
Absolutely. I mean, you otherwise it's an inducement. I mean, you could just imagine, right? How much you give me? I'll just give you $3,000 worth of information rather than $10,000. That's the way. That's human behaviour, isn't it? And then, of course, it can lead to an exaggeration of that evidence.
It seems to me that they've brought themselves a problem, really, because they leave themselves open, don't they, to the
they do.
Suggestion that was then made that the reason that you guys didn't document it was because you were coaching. That's the worst case scenario.
Yeah, no, and that's the point of documentation, right?
And if there's no documentation,
it's dangerous territory. And it would be found in court. It would come out in court.
But as I said at the very start of this episode, much of this didn't come out when Ross was in court. In that summer of 1985, all of this was known only to police, Ernie, and his lawyer, Paddy O'Driscoll. With the beginnings of a deal agreed at the police station on January 10th, 4 days later, O'Driscoll formalised the conversation in a letter to Jenkinson. Yes, O'Driscoll said the terms were stringent, but they were warranted. He said, quote, Ernie is a principal witness to the homicide, and his life has already been threatened. Those involved in the homicide have gang connections. Now that last bit is significant, because Ross had no known gang connections. But that aside, Jenkinson then did the prudent thing and got legal advice.
In the opinion of the lawyers, no inducement has been offered to Ernie that would jeopardise his testimony at any trial. This was reinforced by the fact that Ernie admitted sending the 2 anonymous notes within the prison system. It was considered that the conditions outlined all revolved around ensuring the personal safety of Ernie, and these were acceptable.
There are 2 things to highlight from what Jenkinson's saying there. The first is that the Ernie deal was for his personal safety, not his personal gain. In other words, this was not a reward. That's also how Paddy O'Driscoll remembers the deal.
You've got to remember, this was a murder inside a prison. It was a very hostile situation.
But as far as you can recall, at least in those initial stages, this payment wasn't being put up as a reward.
No, it wasn't.
But after O'Driscoll stopped working on the case, as Ernie and the police continued to correspond, the evidence shows the initial deal morphed into one that both the cops and their star witness would agree was indeed a reward. The second point revolves around Ernie's anonymous notes. Jenkinson seems to be suggesting that the notes can be considered Ernie's first disclosure, which is vital because they were given with absolutely no inducement. But while those notes pointed police to what they believed was the murder weapon, Ernie also wrote that he never saw the murder done.
In the context of this case, the suggestion that the writer hadn't actually seen what had happened is a pretty important part of the statement.
And if these notes were so significant, shouldn't they have been presented in court? Now, whatever you think of the police doing deals like this with witnesses like Ernie, and there are reasonable arguments on both sides, as I see it, the biggest problem with the Ernie deal was not the deal itself per se. It was who the police and the prosecution did not tell of its existence. That included Ross, his lawyers, and the jury at the first trial. And it appears, based on letters you'll hear about, even the police commissioner was kept in the dark. Police acted quickly to satisfy the first of Ernie's demands. On the 15th of January 1985, he was relocated to New Plymouth Prison.
It was agreed I'd be sent to a prison which wasn't so tough, and the type of inmate more human.
Ernie's request for police funding to move overseas was kicked up the police chain of command. Jenkinson's superior asked the deal to be considered by Police HQ in Wellington. He said any future prosecution depended heavily on Ernie, and without him, evidence against the suspect, Ross Appelgren, was light. While Ernie's conditions were being reviewed, he finally agreed to sit down with Jenkinson to give him a formal statement saying he'd witnessed Ross murder Darcy. This was a statement dated the 22nd of February 1985, the one juries did hear about. That 6-week delay raises more questions for Tim McKinnell.
waiting so long to get a statement from somebody like that, there can be legitimate reasons for that. But one thing you need to be really careful of when that occurs is what other incoming information that person receives. Is there a risk of contamination around their statement? Perhaps more concerningly is also that a statement or an account is being manufactured around the facts. And I've seen occasions where they can be self-serving for a variety of reasons.
It's important to say I've read Ernie's correspondence with Jenkinson during this period. Ernie sent a lot of letters. It's clear to me, at least, he continued to maintain in strong terms he had witnessed the murder. In one letter, sent on the 5th of March 1985, he told police,
"There's no point in me lying about what happened and who was involved, as I had nothing really to gain or lose. I could only give a factual account of what happened as I saw it."
This satisfied Jenkinson, and with Ernie's eyewitness account, police decided they had enough evidence to arrest Ross Appelgren on the 8th of March 1985. Now all they had to do was ensure their star witness turned up.
So my conclusion and intention now is to not give evidence at all.
A job easier said than done.
I am not some hunk of shit that can be tossed about.
It would end up dragging the country's most senior legal official into this story.
Oh my God! Well, it certainly doesn't sound satisfactory in any way.
And leave others gobsmacked.
Whoa. I'm stumbling for words. That's flabbergasting.
Coming up on the next episode of Nark. Thanks for listening to Nark, hosted and written by me, Mike Wesley Smith. I'm also extremely grateful to everyone who spoke with me for this podcast, especially Suzanne Young and Julia Appelgren. And if anyone listening has more information about this case, I'd be keen to hear from you. Send an email to nark@rnz.co.nz. Follow and listen to Nark wherever you get your podcasts. And if you've enjoyed it, use the share button to recommend it to a friend. Some more quick thank yous to Ngā Taonga and Mediaworks for some of the archival audio, and to the voice actors who helped bring some of the characters in this episode to life. Nigel Collins, Will Plummer, Brendan Murphy, Phil Vine and Hamish Webber. The RNZ producers who worked on this episode were Liz Garton, William Ray, Duncan Smith and Justin Gregory. The audio engineer was William Saunders. Thanks also to Steve Burridge and Jeremy Ansell for the studio wrangling, and to Kevin Golding for opening the doors to me every week after hours. Graphics were designed by Amrita Marks, and the shorthand page, where you can find more information on this story, was made by Hing Yi Kong. Check it out at rnz.co.nz/nark. Tim Watkin is RNZ's Executive Editor Audio, and Brianna Uritich-Gregg is the Production Coordinator. You can find more of RNZ's great podcasts like The Detail on the RNZ website, rnz.co.nz/podcasts. Check them out. Bye for now.